translocation is when you take an animal and move it outside of its home range. So that's what we did here. We're taking bears and moving them outside their home range. So just as a quick clarifying point. All right, off to a good start of not clicking. Okay, there we go. So as you all know, American black bears are considered the icon of the Smokies, and rightfully so, because their population is estimated at about 1,900 bears in the park alone, which is about 2.3 bears per square mile. They're highly intelligent with the capability of remembering specific food sources. They're tenacious and very food-driven in their behaviors. So these attributes combined with their opportunistic feeding habits make them really prone to conflict with people because they'll take advantage of our unsecured food sources, such as our trash. So the Smokies also has a high human visitor density, as you are all very familiar with living in the area. It's the most visited national park in the nation with over 12 million visitors annually. I believe it's more than the next 3 top visited parks combined. So it's a lot. It's a lot of people in that area at once, usually in the peak summer season. And so as you can imagine, this high human density combined with this high bear density results in quite a high frequency of human-bear conflicts, both within the park boundary and in the surrounding town, such as Gatlinburg. And so what do these human-bear conflicts look like in the Smokies? So I will say this is data that I got in 2024, so it's at least a year dated in terms of when you get the annual reports. So, but it shouldn't be too different, assuming that last year was an insane year. But on average, over the last 3 years, TWRA received over 1,000 calls concerning bears in a single year. And that's about 60% of those were involving conflicts, human-bear conflicts. And they captured 46 of those bears in response to those calls. Some of them had to be euthanized given the behaviors they were displaying that were concerning and a safety risk. I talk a little bit about that later. And then the others were translocated. And then Smoky Mountains is a little bit different in how they record it, but they received 422 reports per year involving bear activity. So they don't really catalog it by like conflict behaviors, so couldn't parse that out. But I will say the park, and Katrina obviously knows this, working in the park, they're very proactive and they really try to nip any conflicts early on from developing. So therefore, they captured 41 bears, and this was in response to developing, and this is on average, remember, capture 41 per year in response to developing conflict behaviors, and then they release them on site as a form of hazing. So hopefully that stops them from engaging in more conflicts. And so you're probably wondering, why are you talking about, like, you know, the park, if your study's in the park, talking about what's happening in Gatlinburg? Well, Jessica Bronstein's study found that a lot of the bears that were thought to be primarily in the park, actually many of them left the park at some point and likely learned these conflict behaviors in nearby towns like Gatlinburg. And then they came back into the park and engaged in conflicts. So that's the tough thing about it, is you could have the Smokies be utterly perfect, but then bears don't really care about our arbitrary boundaries and our lines that we draw. So they leave and they go learn something, and then they'll come back and then keep doing those behaviors. So talking a little bit more about the park's management approach, since that's where our study was focused on. The park takes a very proactive approach to managing human-bear conflicts. It includes several tools, such as educational signage about recreating responsibly in bear country, aversive conditioning in the early stages of conflict behavior. So I mentioned this with on-site release. That's their most common tool they use, and it works pretty dang well, actually. Translocation of bears that are not responding to those aversive conditioning techniques, and then euthanasia of bears demonstrating potentially dangerous conflict behaviors, such as breaking into buildings or vehicles, thus posing a safety risk. I will say the park does not euthanize that many bears per year. And like I said, it is really reserved for like very serious situations where the bear is considered too far gone in its behavior. Because once you have a bear breaking into like buildings or cars or ripping into tents, it's very hard to reverse that behavior. We were interested in analyzing translocation as a management tool because the park translocates an average of 10 bears per year outside of the park boundary. And there were reservations about how effective this tool was at actually preventing further conflict behaviors. And so I always like to talk about this quote that I have on this image. I pulled this from a study in 2007 that surveyed wildlife agencies across North America. So any state or country, included Mexico and Canada as well, any area that has black bears in its jurisdiction. And they found that 44% of agencies that translocate bears do so because of public pressure, but only 15% of the agencies actually believed it was effective at managing conflict behavior. There have been 2 previous studies done in the park looking at translocations and conflict situations. And you can see them here talking about the fates, and these were specific to bears translocated outside of the park boundary. And the biggest takeaways from these is that we largely do not know what happened to these bears. And a big reason for that is because how they determined the fates was based on ear tag recovery. And so you can imagine, to learn like what happened to a bear, that means somebody has to report. You have to find that ear tag again. And so even in terms of mortality, like cause of mortality, it was very biased, because if you think about different causes of mortality, so hunting's a pretty big one, but it would be biased towards that because hunters are they're most likely to call in those ear tags, because obviously they're handling the animal and there's the ear tag, versus like a roadkill. Not everybody stops and checks out every bear to see if it has an ear tag to then report it. And even if they did, many people don't report it anyways. So, you know, we now have much better technology, such as GPS collars, that have the capability of acquiring really fine scale data. So we wanted to essentially relook at this, and that resulted in the translocation study. See, I always do that. So here were our objectives for the study. So we wanted to assess the effectiveness of translocation by determining how things like survival, recurrent conflict, and fidelity vary by several different factors. We wanted to determine whether translocated bears are more prone to mortality compared to resident bears at the release sites and non-translocated conflict bears that stayed in the park. And lastly, we wanted to determine whether translocated bears exhibited different movement patterns compared to resident bears. So before we dive into talking about a little bit about our methods and all the fun results from this, I did want to go over some terminology. I know all of you in the room are very smart and you likely know a lot of these terms, but I have been told that I have a bad habit of just assuming people know these terms. So I'm trying to do a better job at defining things ahead of time. And then obviously if there's anything I missed, didn't define in the presentation, like afterwards, definitely ask me about it. Food conditioning, this is a term that is used all the time when talking about human-bear conflicts. It's a really important term to know. This is the process of a bear becoming accustomed to human food sources and actively seeking them out. And I will say food conditioning is different than habituation. Those get mixed up all the time and used interchangeably, but they mean very different things. And the concerning one is really food conditioning. I will say it is, think of it as like a spectrum. So it develops over time and it can get worse. So you can have different levels of food conditioning. And so we wanted to determine these levels in our analyses to consider. And we did this by analyzing their diet through their hair, which is pretty cool and very complex. But basically, we can just tell based off something called a stable isotope. And again, I'm not going to get into that, but we can just tell whether they're eating more human food or more natural foods. For recurrent conflict, we use this term when we're talking about bears involved in conflict post-translocation. Harvest is just another word for like hunting, so legal take of bears or animals. And then fidelity is animals' tendency to return to a specific location. Animals typically have very high fidelity to their home ranges. For data collection,
can I clarify something? I think it's also good to point out sometimes that, especially around here, we think of food conditioning as automatically like bears see humans as like sources of food, whereas it can be more of a broad term, even of just like a bear just is conditioned to seek out human food in human spaces. They don't necessarily want to go up to a human and grab a hot dog out of their hand necessarily. It's just that they're eating human food sources. So like a bear might still be afraid of you if you walked out as it was eating out of your trash can, right? Because it's just associating your trash can as human food, but it still is afraid of you because it's usually coming in the early hours of the morning, right? But then you have the bears that are also food conditioned that will go up on your picnic table while you're sitting there. And so the park deals with both of those bears, you know, as whereas like I feel like Tita Bray usually tends to deal with more of the bear that is not scared of humans and also wants their food.
Yeah, and that kind of deals with like the level of conditioning, like the severity. And also there's a whole other thing in there that I think we talk about it in our paper, that you have individual personality, which is a thing in wildlife, and you get different behavioral traits like shyness and boldness. So like what you were saying, Katrina, you can still get a food conditioned bear that's a little shy of people. And then you can get bears that are very bold that will approach people for a hot dog per se. And like there's examples of that, like sometimes bears will approach people for backpacks because they learned over time, oh, if I walk up to this person, they throw me the backpack. But that's not every bear. So yeah, it is very much a spectrum of differences. So that's what can be really tough, I think, with food conditioning for people to grasp. But my biggest thing is it is not habituation. Not the same thing. But yes, for data collection, so we had two different groups. We had obviously our translocated bear data set. So these were bears that were being translocated regardless of the study. So the park, as I mentioned, translocates average 10 bears per year. I was essentially taking advantage of that and just putting a collar on them to figure out what happens to them after we move them. Individuals were selected based on previous behaviors, so it wasn't just willy-nilly moving bears. Like the park has really good records of these bears' histories and their behaviors, conflicts they've been involved in. And so we use that. They have a whole protocol to determine of when they actually translocate an animal. And they were transported to one of 9 locations in Cherokee National Forest, which you'll see in a minute on a map. Resident bears were captured near 2 release sites in Pigeon River Gorge. I will probably call it PRG throughout this presentation. And they were released on site. We use these as a control group for comparison purposes. Here's our study area. So you obviously are very familiar with Great Smoky Mountains in blue. Cherokee National Forest is the reddish orange. You can see those 9 release sites labeled. And then the red circle there, that's where we captured the resident bears as a comparison. Diving right into our findings, the fun stuff. So GPS data, we captured and translocated 50 bears total from Smokies to Cherokee National Forest, 2015 to 2023. 20 females, 30 males, ages 1 to 14 with an average of about 5. 28 hair samples for that food conditioning analysis, and over 219,000 GPS locations, which you see on this map. So it's a lot of stacking there, but you can see there's definitely some outliers in terms of movements. Like the blue one, that bear actually made like international news because of her movements. Pretty cool to see, which I'll talk about her a little later. And then 37 resident bears in 2022, 2023, 15 females, 22 males, ages 2 to 16, average age of 5. over 520,000 GPS locations. And this resident population was also, this data set was so good, it's such a big data set, we used it for a total separate project that looked at bear movement corridors along I-40 in the Pigeon River Gorge to identify potential locations for crossing structures. And then lastly, Jessica Bronstein's study that happened a few years before mine. We used data from her study from 39 non-translocated conflict bears. So these bears stayed in the park, again, as a control group for comparison from 2016 to 2018. 17 females, 22 males. Do you guys see a pattern? Males are a lot easier to catch than females. Ages 1 to 16, and again, an average age of about 5.
I think, Kristin, I wanted to make a comment when this slide came up, because these are like just numbers to us, right? But I remember when Kristin, because Kristin and I are good friends, but she was, you know, taking me through the process of this extra project that basically she took on, you know, with this project of the translocation from the park. She took on this extra project of studying resident bears in the national forest. And she was at the University of Tennessee, which was what, like an hour drive away from your trapping site?
Hour and a half. Probably.
Yeah, at least. And so, like, literally she was setting, you know, a handful of traps every weekend you were setting them and then checking them, basically.
Oh, we were out there every day. We caught
the summer,
yeah.
So like,
sorry.
She was basically, no, you're good. She was traveling, you know, every day to this trap site in the national forest and over an hour to go check these traps, which sometimes are completely empty. Sometimes they'd catch the same bear that they had already caught for the study, so you can't use that bear. And then there was at one point where they're trying to get a similar number of males and females, right? And so that's where it was like the last few times you were trapping, you're like, we need some more females. We need some more females. And so just the effort and the care that went into this study was huge. I mean, it's more than some PhD students' projects, I would say, that I know of.
Yeah, I mean, she had a lot of help. Yeah.
Yeah, says Greg. The National Park Service helped a lot with the translocation from the park, but as far as the National Forest one goes, anyway, I'm always impressed when I look at these numbers. So I just wanted to put it out there. They're just numbers, but it's a very impressive group of studies together.
Appreciate it, Katrina. Okay, trigger warning just for everyone in the crowd. This is a photo of a dead bear that was road killed on I-40, so just for your awareness. So first results we're going to go over is just survival in general. So with translocated bear survival, very low. So only a bear had only a 22.3% chance of surviving the year, so not great. And then we did have several bear, like GPS collars based on the data. We're a bit suspicious that they were poached. So if we include those bears as well in the analysis, only 17.6% chance of surviving the year. So what predicts survival for a translocated bear? Season of translocation is very important. So bears that are moved in the fall have much lower survival than those in the spring and summer. Distance translocated. So as you increase the distance between your capture location and your release site, survival goes down. The age of the bear. So the older the bear, the lower the survival. And then sex of the bear. Males had lower survival than females. For cause of mortality for translocated bears, they're most at risk to harvest, so hunting, at 48.2% chance within the year. And then EDP, so this stands for euthanasia. So think lethal removal from like a wildlife agency. So this would be in response to a conflict, a recurrent conflict. Depredation, which also deals with conflict. For those that don't know what that means, depredations are when you have someone who takes a bear, like kills a bear because they're getting into like their chickens, their goats, or cornfields, for example. So it is legal in a lot of states for people to be able to do that to protect their property and their livelihood. And then poaching was also included in that. So that was 18.4% chance within the year, and then followed by road mortality at 15.4. Distance translocated was the only predictor. And as you increased your distance moved, your risk of harvest also increased, but your risk of road mortality decreased, interestingly enough. In terms of EDP, distance was not an important indicator for that. Now for the comparison, so for bears, resident bears in the PRG, their annual survival was 78.7%. For bears that remained in the park, it was 86.9%, so a lot higher. And then we did a comparison on the cause of mortality for translocated versus residents. And I will say, you might notice, why is the translocated so much more than the number we just saw? This is because it's a subset of that data. So it is translocated bears that were moved the same years that we had residents. So it was 2022, between 2022 and 2024 is when we stopped monitoring. And it was to that specific area as well. So both residents and translocated bears were most at risk to harvest, but you can see translocated bears were much more at risk. Specifically, they had an 11.1 times increased risk of mortality due to harvest compared to residents. And then for road mortality, you do see that they were more susceptible to road mortality as well. It's statistically significant. All right, so our wrap up for their survival or takeaways. As I mentioned, translocated bears have very low survival, much lower than their resident and non-translocated counterparts. This suggests that translocation may not be as non-lethal as we previously thought. The lower survival is likely a combination of the translocation event and conflict behaviors. So the risk of harvest is likely a novel risk for these bears. If you think about it, the park, right, is protected. Hunting is strictly prohibited in the park. And then we're taking these bears to national forest land where bear hunting is culturally very important and very popular. And there's a lot of pressure. And I'll say that these bears probably, as a result of that, they probably have a different risk perception of humans, and they're not used to that type of interaction with humans, right? Because they're not really encountering that. They may encounter it if they leave the park boundary during the fall, but they're not encountering it like these resident bears are, which we saw in our analyses. Another factor that is probably at play here is that these translocated bears are in an area that is unfamiliar to them. They don't know their surroundings. We're taking them from a place they know well to a place they don't. And even though this is anecdotal, this was supported by comments that I received in the field from hunters. So typically when I would pick up callers, I would always ask hunters questions about the behaviors, especially if it was a translocated bear, because I was curious about this. And I had several hunters that told me that they treed a lot quicker than their resident counterparts. And I even had one guy that told me that it appeared that the bear did not know where it was going. So again, that just shows like we're taking them from a place they know super well to a landscape they don't know well. And then they're having interactions they're not used to. For recurrent conflict, we wanted to look into like what the chances were for a bear to engage in recurrent conflict post-translocation. We found that the chances within the year was 38.8%. And I will say this is based on official reports to wildlife agencies only. But what about human-bear conflicts that go unreported? We know that there's unreported conflicts. So in an attempt to do this, I parsed through all of our GPS data and I recorded GPS clusters that were in residential areas. So for example, on top of someone's house, indicating they're hanging out for a few hours in like a driveway or a deck. When I say on top, I mean like literally the cluster's gotta be right there where I know that there's gotta be some feeding or something happening. Or if the clusters were in urban areas like downtown. And even though we're used to seeing bears in downtown, that's not typical bear behavior. A true wild bear does not want to be near humans really, and they don't want to be in a downtown area like Gatlinburg. I did not count clusters that were in densely forested areas nearby a house. That's not to say that that couldn't be a conflict, but it's just, you know, with all the food sources we have in the Southeast and like how you can have these interspersed houses like in the forest, that one, I didn't want to include that with the uncertainty. So this photo on the right demonstrates what a cluster is, what that looks like, or what I'm looking for when I was doing this. So you can see the yellow line on the bottom there. That's indicative of movement. So the dots are GPS locations. And so since they're spread out over this time, that shows that it's moving. But then you see that big like star. What those white lines are, that is not lines indicating movement. That's just, in this case, Google Maps or Google Earth, actually. That's just how the program's telling me, hey, all these dots are right on top of each other. So it's a call out. So all of those dots are concentrated. So that is telling me, and keep in mind, these GPS locations, they have time intervals. So like in this case, our callers were programmed to take a location every 20 minutes for the first 2 months, and then every hour for the remainder of the caller's life. And so in this case, that bear was there for several hours. That's telling me that it was on a food source. And obviously, if it's on top of someone's house, that's telling me they're maybe feeding them, or it's getting into trash or bird feeders or something like that. So when we incorporate those clusters with our report, our official report data, that brings our recurrent conflict closer to 54.6% chance within the year. In terms of predictors for recurrent conflict, the only important factor was the level of food conditioning. So we found that the more food conditioned the bear, the more likely to engage in recurrent conflict.
And
so
that, that's measured by the stable isotopes from the hair. The food the food conditioning chart you just showed, the degree of food conditioning. Yeah, that's based on the stable isotopes. So that level of food conditioning for everyone, just so you know, is not something apparent to you until you've done a bunch of lab work after you caught the bear and looked at its hair. So you wouldn't know this number, this relative ratio of food conditioning, until well after you've turned the bear loose.
Yep. Good point, Greg. That's the kind of tough thing about food conditioning, is applying it to the field. Because we know of instances where we maybe thought a bear was conditioned. I know Jessica had this in her study, where thought a bear was conditioned, but then based on the hair, it came back not conditioned. And that's, again, dealing with, like, just because you see a bear like licking a grill does not necessarily mean that it's food conditioned yet. It could be that was just its intro into it, or like if a bear was eating snacks on the side of a trail that someone dropped, it could just be taking advantage in that moment. But you don't want that to continue.
I was gonna say it takes a lot of human food for this to come up in a bear's hair. This isotope of carbon-13 is more common in human processed sugars, and that's how you can use it as a way to say this bear is eating human food sources. But it has to be eating significant amounts of that food for it to actually be stored in the hair in that isotope. So it's not something that's apparent just because a bear ate enriched hot dog bun one time. It'd have to be eating that stuff regularly to show up in the hair.
Yep, you introduce it well, because I think I talk about that in the next.
Oh, sorry. I thought you were gonna like not do that because it may have seemed like a little bit too.
No. I didn't go that into detail, just because the stable isotopes is like, it's a very complex it's really cool. It's complex. So usually I try to keep it basic, just because but that's exactly right. That like that's how we tell, is it's based on the plants and how they fix carbon. That's how we can tell the difference between natural foods and what our foods are, which have a lot of corn and sugar cane. But yeah, for the important takeaways for recurrent conflict. So our study did find that most of our bears did not re-engage in recurrent conflict post-translocation, but when you included those clusters, it's a little bit of a different story. It kind of pushed it over that 50% chance threshold. I will say a really big caveat with that, though, is that most of our study animals died within 6 months of them being translocated. So you do have to consider that there's several bears that didn't have a chance per se to engage in conflict. So they didn't have that temptation yet. So just something to keep in mind, like with those results. The higher probability when including those clusters in those human developed areas, like at houses or in towns, could be indicative of that underreporting I talked about. We know that people's tolerances for different behaviors varies from person to person. So if a bear is on my porch, placing its paws on my screen door, I would consider that a human bear conflict, and I would call my local conflict specialist with my state agency to report it. But that doesn't mean my neighbor thinks that's a conflict. In fact, I know there's several people in Gatlinburg and Asheville that think that's very cute behavior. And I get it. It's really cool to see a bear. Like, I love seeing bears. And like, yeah, it'd be cool to see one in my backyard. But also, I don't really want a bear that close to where I'm living. And I don't want to risk its life, by getting into attractants. Our connection between the level of food conditioning and recurrent conflict clearly demonstrates how difficult it is to reverse food conditioning once it takes root. So remember, food conditioning is that process that we talked about. So like Greg was saying, it does take time to build that up. And so the more severely food conditioned bears, it's really difficult. Essentially, to reverse it, you have to completely remove the reward, the stimuli. And this just gets to human psychology with the term conditioning. And that is like virtually impossible to do that when it gets to that point. And I will say bears don't, as Greg mentioned, bears don't decide to get hooked on human foods overnight. It progresses over time. So we want to prevent that process from ever beginning in the first place. Or if it does begin, we want to nip it in the bud quickly. So I know that's kind of with the park, like why they're so on top of keeping records on bears, so they know they have a better idea. Even obviously they can't have a perfect catalog of it, but they have a better idea.
Kristin, can I say something about like the type of conflict, or are you going to talk about that in a minute?
I was not.
Okay. I was just going to say that these types of conflicts that were reported after the bears were translocated were usually of a different nature for a lot of these bears and what they were actually moved out of the park for, just because they didn't have access to, let's say, a chicken coop when they lived in the park. A bear who was in a picnic area in the park could have gotten translocated to the national forest and then found a residence with chickens and destroyed their chicken coop and killed their chickens. But that wasn't what he was translocated from the park for. He was translocated because he was lingering in a picnic area in the daytime, and the park was like, let's get him out of here. So some of these bears were moved near other temptations that they had no familiarity with. They were moved closer to things that they actually didn't have access to in their previous locations. But what that illustrates to me is that we don't have far enough to move bears away in the Southeast or in Tennessee to get them away from what you were saying, that stimulus, to actually reverse that conditioning. You can't put them in a deep enough wilderness to where they won't be able to find humans or human attractants.
Yeah, and who doesn't like chicken?
Yeah, everything like chicken.
Everyone loves chicken.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yes. So if you have a chicken coop, electrify it, which I talk very minimally about electrification later. But there's another comment I was about to add to that about, another thing too, just like with human bear conflicts in general, is it varies state to state and even within a state, agency to agency, in terms of like what's considered a conflict as well. So something to keep in mind. There are some places that don't consider bird feeders conflicts, but there's other places that do. I personally do. I think that's the gateway drug into a lot of conflicts. But
she stole my line, guys. She got that from me. You guys have heard me say that before.
I definitely did not get that from you. You probably got that from me. I've been saying that for years before I knew you. But
okay,
anyways,
all right.
I don't want to suck too much time before questions. But so now moving into what we call homing. So this is another word for this, is just like their likelihood of returning back to their original capture location. And we wanted to know, what is that likelihood? So for adults, it was within the year, 61.5% chance. Subadults was 11.1. In terms of when they return, the average was 55 days, but the range was 22 to 120. Homing probability decreased as distance translocated increased. And of the bears that returned, so we had 10 out of the 50 that returned. And of those 10, 40% engaged in recurrent conflict after they returned home. For release site fidelity, so we talked about their fidelity to their capture site, but now we have what is their fidelity to where we put them. So do bears stay where we put them? Subadults are much more likely than adults. Adults had a 0.001, less than 0.001% chance versus subadults was 69.2% chance. And I will say we looked at fidelity on a monthly basis to try and get some variation, because we noticed that we'd have bears that left the release site and then actually went back to the release site, which I'll show you in a minute, a map of that. So we wanted to account for that variation in our models. And so we found that fidelity did decrease with months post-translocation, but another caveat, because of a lot of these bears, died, that likely really affected that. So this suggests they may have hung out a little bit and then dispersed, but also with the high levels of mortality, it definitely impacted our fidelity as well. Our takeaways from this, so obviously the closer you translocate, the more likely to return. This is something we knew from previous studies, not all too surprising. Bears are very good at homing, especially adults, as we saw. Subadults they're a better candidate for translocation because they had a lower homing rate and higher release site fidelity. And then we do always get asked, like, okay, but what's the threshold? Like, if I want to translocate a bear anyways, what's the threshold? To make it a little more realistic, it did 80% probability of no return. And even at that, adults have to be moved a minimum of 136 kilometers. Apology, I don't have the miles off the top of my head. Maybe Katrina or Greg can assist me with conversion.
It's like 60. It's 60 miles.
Okay, and then for subadults,
it's 1.6 kilometers per mile. So if you do half plus, sorry, not 60, it'd be like 90 in miles. 90, okay. Plus 45, it'd be like 90 miles.
Far for adults.
I was thinking 60 was the number I'd heard before. So 60 was not supported by the data. 60 was like how far we tried to move some bears.
Which that's stuff, like a 3-hour in the park. Like that's like really a 3-hour journey one way, because we're talking about mountain roads, and a lot of times it's Forest Service roads, and so 90 miles in Wisconsin or Nebraska isn't that far, but Smokies it's pretty significant.
Yeah, 90 miles going 90 miles per hour in the Dakotas. And then for subadults, it was a lot less at 54 kilometers.
Yeah, so that's only that's under 30 miles right there. So yeah,
so a lot more doable. And again, the fact that you don't even need to take them as far, and they won't return home, and they like to stick, it just makes them a little better candidate, which I go over at the end. In terms of GPS data, so I'd mentioned this earlier, how we had some that left and returned to the release site. So this map in the background is an example of that. If you look at the little purple pink pin that to the left of the takeaways box, that is the original capture location in the park. And then the bear was taken to the yellow pin up there in the upper right corner. And you can see that he did make it about halfway and then decided to go back and actually set up shop near the release site, which was really cool. This, honestly, in this study, even just looking at the movement maps, I really enjoyed, because I just think even observationally, we could really get a lot of information. It's hard to quantify this versus seeing it. And what was really cool about this bear, so he actually lived, he was a subadult male. He lived beyond a year. He made it 2 years. He sadly was hit on I-40, but he actually is the bear that inspired the I-40 project that I mentioned at the beginning that we did as well for like alongside this study. And he crossed I-40 successfully like 7 times or something in a month, which is pretty crazy. And not surprised that it unfortunately took his life later on, but just really cool data to see as an example of some of these movements.
He also stayed out of trouble the whole time.
Yeah, he did.
Yeah.
He stayed out of trouble. Yep. Yeah, he was a very good bear. Yeah, he had a good life up there in the good old PRG. We actually captured him as a recap on a year later on our I-40 capture effort. So that was really cool to see, and just how good he was doing and how healthy he was.
And that bear, that was the one I caught in Cades Cove picnic area, right? He was Cades Cove picnic area and moved. Yeah. Okay. So
I think so.
That bear was so you guys, that bear was moved from Cades Cove picnic area to north of I-40 into the national forest.
Yeah. This then kind of is a really good transition into movement. So we did do a comparison between translocated bears and resident bears in terms of movements, and found that translocated bears traveled more per day than residents, but it really varied by month. And the big takeaway is that it's the denning months is where it actually significantly differed between movements. And so why is that? You might be asking, Kristin, why would they be moving more during the denning months? Because we hypothesized that it actually would have been in the summer or shortly after they were translocated. We assumed that shortly after you moved them, you'd see a lot of more movement, right? Getting their bearings, maybe trying to go back home or whatever it be. But that wasn't the case. And so likely what it is, our theory is that similar to with the hunting, right? You have these bears on an unfamiliar landscape, and bears have incredible memories. So they remember, specific food sources, the timing of those food sources. They definitely do it with denning too. They remember desirable den areas. They'll sometimes reuse dens. And so we think that it could be that because they're unfamiliar with the landscape, that they're just unfamiliar with these denning locations. We did see February was the only month of all the typical denning months that they didn't differ from residents. So maybe they hunkered down for a little bit, but just an interesting observation. I will say though, when you plot the total distance traveled against the total days monitored, you see a lot of overlap between the two groups. And so I think when you're talking about movements with translocated bears, especially comparing it to like a bear that's not moved, rather than talking about it in terms of distance, I think it's better to think about it in geographic space. And I was talking about how I love my maps and my movement maps, my data maps. So again, we can do this visually. So on the left is an adult female translocated bear. And then on the right is a similarly aged adult female resident bear. And the big takeaway from these two images is if you look down here at the scales of these maps. So the left one is 0 to 122 kilometers versus the right one is 0 to 5 kilometers. And females typically have very tight home ranges. They occasionally will go on a walkabout, but usually they have very, very small tight home ranges, unlike males that have much larger. That's why this was such a crazy, and I mentioned this at the beginning, this female made like international news because she went through 4 states twice within 6 months. And she even went through the park, I think within like 7 miles of her original capture location, but didn't slow down. Like she just kept going, which was really interesting, especially because that wasn't really typically thought of females. It was kind of assumed that males would be maybe the ones to move more, but we even had a couple other females, not quite as large as this one, like in terms of the geographic space covered, but still like bopping from North Carolina to Georgia and Tennessee multiple times. So wrapping up, this brings us back to our original question, right? How effective is translocation at managing conflicts? I threw a lot of data at you tonight. Well, everything that I talked about today, you can see there's a lot of factors at play. So on one hand, our recurrent conflict was not awful, but it wasn't very low either. And on the other hand, most of these bears didn't survive the year post-translocation. So does that make translocation worthwhile? Based on our results, it may not be the best option for adult bears and for severely food conditioned bears, but it could be an option for subadults, keeping in mind that they do still suffer from high mortality in the study system. Another important factor to consider is the cost. So Katrina already talked about, right, like if we were to translocate that recommended distance for adults, like how long of a drive. So think of the gas, and then technically any of those drives, you also incorporate like truck maintenance into there. It can add up. So we calculate, and this number, honestly, this number was calculated in 2024, and we know things have gotten even more expensive. So this number is likely out of date already, but we had estimated that for both like Smoky Mountain, based on Smoky Mountain staff and TWRA staff, the minimum average amount was $1,000. It definitely is likely more, especially if you're collaring. That adds.
Those are tax dollars that are already allocated, though, guys. So it's not like it's money that wouldn't be spent. Just so keep in perspective, they're going to pay the workers whether they're sitting in their office or out there in the field doing this. So they're all getting
that is
regardless.
True. But you could gear it towards other things, other preventative things. But just keep in mind of like, you know, that there is the financial component, and if that money could be maybe used towards some preventative actions, some proactive actions, right? So that kind of brings us to the next point, probably the biggest point from the study that I like to make, that rather than focus, so this study was looking at the bear, right? The bear aspect of human-bear conflicts. And that's traditionally what it's been, is we have focused a lot of time and effort on how can we solve this from the bear aspect. And it's challenging. And I think that it's pretty much a consensus amount, or with bios, that rather than focusing on the bear aspect of human-bear conflicts, a more positive outcomes can come from shifting it to the human aspect. So when you move a bear due to human-bear conflict, it does not really address the core issue at hand, right? You're removing what you think is the problem. But it's only a matter of time until another bear finds that attractant and begins to engage in human-bear conflicts, especially when you're in such a high-density area, like in the southeast around the Smoky Mountains. Like that is bound to happen. So we need to secure those attractants. Many people don't even realize what an attractant is, what things attract bears, what can cause human-bear conflicts. So a lot of that just deals with basic education, right? Like robust education programs like BearWise are really great because they can help teach people how to recreate and live responsibly in bear country. And then lastly, policies that benefit bears can have a huge impact. So things like trash ordinances have shown to be extremely effective at reducing human-bear conflicts. There's studies in Florida and Colorado that have shown this, and likely other places as well. I know Asheville has been working on one that hopefully should be published soon. However, these container upgrades, these bear-resistant container upgrades, are costly, and that does usually fall on the consumer. So I always like to mention this, that establishing cost share programs can be really beneficial to help people get on board with implementing BearWise practices. And the same can be said for other cost share programs like electric fence incentive programs. So I mentioned electric fencing earlier. That's a really great tool with bears. That's a program that I run here where I live in the North Cascades of Washington. We have an electric fence incentive program where we pay for half the cost of an electric fence up to $500. And it really incentivizes people to secure attractants. And it's been really successful in other areas where we offer this program as well. So just things to keep in mind that can really help get ahead of the bear conflicts, because we don't want them to happen in the first place.
Yeah, Kristen, we loan free electric fences to our locals here, and we go help set it up for them too.
Yeah, just like that. Like those type of programs are huge. As just a quick like acknowledgments, because as was mentioned earlier, I had a lot of help obviously with this. Like the translocation bears, like that's 2015 to 2023. I came on in 2021. So Ryan and Greg, and then a ton of seasonal technique, like Katrina helped several years, and other interns helped. Project partners, National Park Service, Forest Service, and TWRA, and then our funding was from National Park Service and the National Park Foundation. So all of this work could not have been done without all these folks helping me out. And if there's any questions, I know it's Greg's
That's me
favorite.
carrying that bear on my back, if you guys were wondering.
Kristen had to throw it in there to, to tickle.
It didn't end up lasting long like that. We had to change how we were doing it, but it made for a cool picture.
That was a terrible day.
That was a terrible day. Katrina was there too.
Yeah, I got bit by a bear that day.
It is a nip. She got nipped. It's fine. All right, let's open up the chat. I know you guys got a lot of questions.
I'll start it out while people are typing. So, Kristen, one of the things that I remember you were saying in your thesis defense, because people always want to read these papers, specifically in this case, biologists want to read these papers and say, reading this paper, should I relocate this bear? Should I take the time? Should I take the money to relocate this bear? Or should I just, translocate this bear? Or should I euthanize it? And can you speak a little bit to that, like how you wanted to structure your discussion based on the results, to not just say yes or no to the question?
Yeah, so we like very purposely did not, and you noticed this probably in the presentation, I didn't ever say like it was successful or failure. And that's I know there's at least one study that did it that way, like looked at success failure, right? Big reason is kind of what I mentioned earlier, is it really varies agency to agency, like even within a state. So like park versus the state wildlife agency, for example, between states, very different situations. That was a very big reason that we didn't specifically say what success or failure was, because people are going to interpret that differently. And so, for example, with like the harvest component, to some people, it's like, well, that's not really a worthwhile, like for us to be doing that if they're going to be harvested. But I know some places in the US where it's a pretty sensitive situation in terms of like euthanizing bears. And so at least like harvest can be viewed as like a recreation opportunity for hunters, and that's not wasted, right? Because when we euthanize bears, it's wasted meat. And even if you disagree with bear hunting, it's still like, it's not great to be wasting an animal that way. And so that's like a really big reason why I refrain from saying, what I'm not going to recommend to your agency, like when I don't know all the ins and outs of like your communities and what you're dealing with.
So thanks, you, Kristen. We have a hand raised from Linda Wagner. Linda, if you want to turn your microphone on, you can ask the question out loud. And then we got a chat question from Lee Merrill. But go ahead, Linda. And Linda, you're muted if you're trying to speak. You got to unmute yourself. You got to hit the microphone button.
She may not be.
How can we unmute her? Did she mean to? Linda, did you mean to raise your hand?
She didn't mean.
Okay, well,
go for
Lee Merrill has a question about our trash can straps. We have a couple trash can straps left. We got cleaned out pretty heavily, and even though the straps are only about $6, we found out people don't even really want to pay for those, and they actually want you to come put them on their trash cans for them. So unfortunately, bears suffer because people are very cheap and lazy a lot of times. But we may get money awarded by a grant to make more trash can straps again, but
because we made them.
We made them all by hand ourselves. Had to get the materials and stuff, and it's just a lot of work to make 100, 200. I think we made 500.
A lot.
Yeah, it was a lot of trash can straps. We went and put them out multiple days out in the field, and it's good work and it helps, but you really need the buy-in from the community, and folks need to take some initiative. Richard Seacrest, do y'all have an article on how to properly secure your trash can yourself? Kristen, you got stuff about that, right? You got resources for people to secure their trash cans?
Securing it, like you're saying, with those straps that you're talking about?
Yeah, like how to make your own straps and stuff. The best way to secure your trash can is to keep it locked in your garage and then take it to the dump if you can, or just put it out right before the trash truck comes and gets it. But I think there's some Bearwise handouts that teach you how to build straps, or no?
No, I don't think so. Lee, we can send out an email. It'd be probably good to make something like that so people can make it. It's really all it is like webbing, some buckles, and some locking nuts and screws.
Yeah, so it's a little bit of hardware, a little bit of webbing. You just gotta cut holes in it and melt the ends and stuff. But we could make something like that. Maybe, Kristen, maybe we could work together with you guys, Defenders, and make a how to make your own trash can straps how-to guide.
And then you gotta get it IGBC approved.
Yeah, we get it. Yeah, the thing about the trash can straps, Lee and Richard, is trash can straps work for a less persistent bear. It's kind of a quick fix, but if you let a big bear work at them for a while, he'll break them and get the trash can open. It's really more of a mild deterrent that the bear is like, oh, that didn't open, I'm going to move on. But a bear who's really getting trash and getting food will work at it and drag your trash can all over the place and probably just pry the lid off at the joint if it's just out there all the time.
Yeah, I would definitely suggest, like, obviously a bear resistant container, like a bear resistant version of your can, is the best option, but I know that not every area can service those, right? Like, I deal with that a lot where I live. Like, there's certain communities that literally the waste hauler does not have trucks that can service those. So then there's other solutions too. Like, I normally don't suggest straps just because of that like you can get a bear that will just break them off, and then you've got the same problem and you invested time into that. So usually I recommend, like, if you can't get a BRC, you get if you could construct an enclosure, and there's a couple different plans for that, or you could do electric fencing, like even if it's
Florida, Kristen, I think Florida has instructions on their website for how to build a bear resistant enclosure for your trash can. But Richard, you may need to talk with your trash pickup service. You can put any trash can on your property, but if you have a trash pickup service, then they'll tell you whether or not they'll service your trash can. That's what Kristen was getting at, is sometimes they'll say it has to be this style can. And there are cans that are made to be, what is it, like a single operator, truck can dump it. They can pick it up and it's automated, like automatic.
Fully automated.
There's cans that are fully automated. They're expensive, but you can find them. But if you really want to nip it in the bud, you keep your trash locked up and you take it to the dump. And in Sevier County, I'm able to do that in Wears Valley very easily. In Townsend, I think your closest dump is the other side of Maryville.
I know they're talking about putting in a convenience center by the elementary school.
Right. Townsend is discussing putting a convenience center with like a trash compactor for residents in Townsend to use. And near the Townsend Elementary School. So that would be huge.
They're also in the process, Richard, of passing an ordinance that requires businesses. Now, this is obviously just in the city of Townsend, which is difficult because it's so small, right? But that they are required to have bear or animal resistant containers. And so that would hopefully help move that in the direction of, TC Environmental and whoever else comes and picks up trash to make it possible for people to have bear resistant trash. Like, it's a slow process, but I think we're starting to kind of trend in that direction.
If you do buy a bear resistant trash can, like the ones made by Toter and Kodiak can is really good, right, Kristen? That's the ones that are really good, the Kodiak cans. Kodiak cans are great. just make sure you strap it to a tree or something when it's not out for pickup, because a bear will just drag it off. He won't get in it, but he'll drag it down a hill or something. So Daryl's got his hand raised. Go ahead, Daryl. You can turn on your mic.
Trying it now. Can you hear me?
We hear you.
Well, first off, fantastic presentation, Kristin. Kristin, I don't know if I ever had the chance to introduce myself. I was actually the first curator at the Appalachian Bear Rescue back in the late 1990s. And then I went on to work for TWRA. I was their big game coordinator, chief of wildlife for a long time. I left in 2015, so that's why I think we never overlapped. Ever since I left, it went downhill from there. No, I'm just anyway, this is really good stuff. Is there one of the take-home messages, and I think you figure it out if you watch these enough, is translocation can work in some situations. Doesn't work in a lot of situations, but there are definitely some situations. And just so you know, I'm out in Utah right now, so I'm actually in your neck of the woods. We have the luxury of, if a bear needs to be relocated, you can move it way, way far away, so it never returns. You don't have that luxury in the East. You're bounded by cities everywhere. So it definitely can be a useful tool. What I was wondering is, if Greg, I don't know if you or Kristin could send me a link to her paper or even a recording of this. I completely let it slip my mind about tonight's presentation, and there's a couple of people from the West who deal with bears all the time that would very much enjoy this presentation. So if you send me either a link to your paper or a recording of this video, I'll make sure those guys get it. So
yeah, we'll have the recording, so we can send it to you for sure, Daryl. And then I know Kristin's got all her papers and her materials. She's got
I've got a million versions of the other process.
she's probably done 50 different versions of this presentation for different audiences, depending on her time with it.
It's really good stuff. So appreciate everything you did for this, both of you guys. So, or all three of you.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'm happy to, if you send him the presentation and send me his email, Greg. The paper, I'll say, like, goes into a lot more detail about a lot of this stuff. Like, obviously there's the whole like stats and everything methods, but then even in the discussion, like, that is kind of the heart of it, you know, as in any paper. And I go into a lot more detail and nuances, and like exactly that. I actually meant to mention that in terms of the release site fidelity, that like, yeah, that is a pretty big factor, especially in the Southeast, that we do kind of want them to stay near there. Because I know that was one thing when I was designing it, like what I considered fidelity. And I know some people were like, well, does it really matter if they stay there? Like, well, kind of in the Southeast, because yeah, like we don't have very many places that are truly like wild and away from people. And so that would be ideal if they stayed here, because that's the least likely chances. And like Greg said, you still have houses that are like interspersed, like where I was working in the PRG, like that was in Forest Service, but we still had houses sprinkled in there. So yeah, that is a really valid point, that in the West, it's a pretty different story. I will also say with this project, like a big caveat in general is that our study system is kind of unique in that, again, it's a protected area going to a heavily hunted area. So like other study sites, for example, like in Utah, you don't have, you've got national parks and stuff, but it may be pretty different. Like if you're just looking, for example, in general, like outside, like Forest Service land, you'd have different results than this probably.
I just want to add, I was chuckling to myself when Katrina was talking about how you were at the University of Tennessee and you had to drive an hour like every week. And it's like, that's my commute every day. In the West, towns are like 3 hours apart, and that's like normal.
Yeah. I have to drive 2 hours.
Nothing close out West.
Yeah, I have to drive 2 hours just to get to my doctor, because I live in a very small town. So yeah, it's a little different out here.
Yeah. All right. Well, great job. I'll sign off.
Yeah. Thanks,
Thank
Daryl.
you.
Any other questions, guys? Linda Wagner, I know your hand was up. I wasn't sure if you still had a question, if you did it on accident. So anybody else got a question for the chat by voice?
I know, just a comment. I know that both the National Park Service and I know Jessica's on here. I won't make her talk, but and Tennessee Wildlife Resource Agency, using this paper, has kind of come to the conclusion that they'll probably translocate less bears in the coming years. Just as far as, the time traveling, but also knowing that relocating within the National Park Service has actually proven to be relatively effective. And I know Ryan's working on finding out more information and data specifically about moving bears into the park. But the park is still relatively a small area as far as the bear travels or the crow flies, because you can really only get 30 miles away.
Yeah,
from
like
end to
30,
end.
37, I think, is like end to end the longest point.
So that's also a difficult thing. But currently, I know Tennessee Wildlife Resource Agency is struggling with this idea of well, there's no point at all to translocate bears because it's just a waste of time and money, right? And I think that's where it comes into the discussion of, like what Kristin was saying, is do you think that even a harvested bear is, worth the time and the taxpayer money that's already being spent on moving that bear to potentially be harvested rather than just being put down by the state?
Be harvested by a taxpayer.
But it's an interesting conversation, right? For us to just look at black and white. Hey, does this work? Hey, this doesn't work. And I think we need to be careful with that information of oh, this does not work. 80-something% of the time, it's considered, that bear's dead anyway, right? And so maybe that doesn't work. But in the end, the National Park Service obviously manages slightly different than the state does. They have different capacities. But I do think it's interesting.
Yeah, they also have different mission statements. And that's kind of what I was getting at with the differences between states and agencies. It's across the board. Even Washington versus Idaho or Oregon per se, it's different. Even though they're state wildlife agencies, they operate a little different. And same with definitely Park Service, that does kind of go against what their mission statement is just moving them for that purpose, right? And so that's why for me, the biggest takeaway is we just need to get ahead of it. And Daryl said, yeah, I think that there are some instances where it can work, and then you have the whole other aspect, which we did not look into in this study because it's kind of hard to you can't really quantify it, but you have to think of the animal itself and potential stress. And that would be a whole other study of trying to monitor cortisol. There's different things you can implant and stuff to monitor that, but that's a whole different subject. But this to consider.
And, Kristin, one thing to tell people is that none of the bears who were moved in this study were bears that were breaking into houses or breaking into cars.
No.
That level of conflict was never even considered for translocation. So when you think about the conflict in this sense, a lot of them were pretty mild, moderate conflict bears in the park, and not the typical bear that would be euthanized, but may end up euthanized later down the road if you allowed it to continue with what it was doing. So this was kind of another attempt at being proactive, and compared to just letting the bear stay where it is in some of these levels of conflict, the bear might be better off staying where it's at and you just being more proactive with that individual bear. But in the Park Service, that's something you can do. State agencies can't really treat bears that way. And that's where this is exclusive to park management and mission statement, versus a lot of states can't, sit outside someone's house waiting for a bear to show up to chase it off. Because it'll just go to someone else's house. But a campground, right. One campground in the national park, one campground is surrounded by tens of thousands of acres of wilderness. So you can keep a bear out of that one campground, and chances are it doesn't go find another campground. But a bear in a neighborhood just goes and finds another neighborhood.
Yeah, and I think too, to that point, yes, we do not relocate or translocate bears that are showing pretty serious conflict behaviors, like Greg said, or aggressive behaviors, right? That's not something that we do. But I will say, as I was saying earlier about how state to state you get differences, in California, they have a very different situation because they have an area with some prominent groups that have essentially pigeonholed the agency in where they can't really do much. And so they were translocating bears that broke into homes several times, which gets into a lot of different issues. And that's a really unfortunate situation. And I know a lot of those bios, or I know several of those bios that work or have worked in that area. And it's tough because that's kind of a scary thing, right? So the behavior and the types of conflicts are super important, which, you know, Greg talked a little bit about during the presentation as well, is like what goes into that. And that's why the park does have such a strict protocol. And I'll say too, between like the state agency and National Park Service, it is a bit easier for the park in terms of it's a smaller area and like they have a whole team dedicated to that, versus on the outside of the park, you get that whole private property, like the intermixed of, you know, with the town, a lot of tourism, and you don't have the same level of staff for like the volume of people in and out. And so that can also,
and
that's just,
you don't have the authority. You know, the Park Service has the authority to close areas and manage all areas however they want. You can't even
close downtown strip.
Yeah.
And
For that matter, Kristin, bringing it full circle, you know, Tennessee barely has laws that prevent feeding bears, or barely, you know, has laws that make you lock your trash up. And if you can't have a law that, you know, penalizes someone for feeding a bear, and you don't have laws that require trash to be secured, and you know, you're fighting a losing battle. So it's very tough in those interfaces to manage this. And unfortunately, the bear pays the price every single time, because the bear is the one thing you can manage, because you can't tell people what to do on their private property.